Hello and welcome to We Turned Out Okay. I am so excited because I am here with my guest today. It is Gail Clanton. She's Gail Clanton. I first heard Gail speaking on the Let's K-12 Better podcast with Amber Coleman Mortley and her daughters. And I'm very excited. I'm hoping, Gail, that we'll be able to talk a little bit about how you know Amber and her girls. Um, Gail's ideas on creativity and building community really made me want to get her to know her better. So when Gail said yes to coming onto my show, I was thrilled. And now I'm thrilled to bring you in on our conversation. Gail Clanton, welcome to We Turned Out Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. I was like over the moon when you said yes. I was like, yay. So how do you know, actually, I suppose what I should probably do though is to say, Amber Coleman Mortley is someone that I know from the Parenting in Place masterclass. So there's this there's a series that a couple of really well-known parenting authors and educators named Catherine Reynolds Lewis and Debbie Reber have been putting on, and Amber was a part, and my fingers are crossed that she will be part of the upcoming one, but she was a part of the fall series. And just her knowledge about screens and tech and kids really shone through, and I just I've loved getting to know her in the Parenting in Place masterclass, which I will link to that, by the way. Everybody listening, I want to make sure that that I link to the stuff that we talk about. And so then I was listening to Amber's podcast and I heard you, Gail, and it was such a warm, supportive conversation. And I, as I say, I knew I needed to get you on my show. How are you and Amber connected?
I knew Amber before Amber knew herself. I actually went to college with Amber's mom. And so I knew when Amber was, in her mom's womb. I connected with her as a little girl. I just always felt a very special connection with Amber. And even though miles separated us for many, many years, now that she's living not too far from me, we've had a wonderful opportunity to reconnect. And I'm so very proud of the podcast that she does with her girls. So when I was asked to be a part of it, I was thrilled. I was a part of a series that she did on What's Your Why? And so I joined just to talk about why I do some of the things that I've done. And it was a wonderful conversation.
Oh, that's awesome. That's actually really where I love to start off a conversation. Well, I love to talk about family. I love to talk about, I'd love to hear more about your family and your life growing up and sort of how you got into doing what you're doing. And I suspect that that's going to lead really quickly into your why.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I grew up in a wonderful family with a great set of parents and a wonderful brother. And when I speak, I talk about the fact that my growing up was great. It was wonderful. I had lovely opportunities to get great education, to travel, went to college, came home, got the apartment and started dating and got married and then got divorced. Oh. And that's when I tell people my story gets really interesting, because that's when I really began to embrace the power of words. I began to really see how writing could help heal and transform our lives. And that's been a big part of what I've been doing to build community and to build a feeling of fellowship, particularly now during this period of isolation, during this period of the pandemic. So when I was speaking with Amber and her girls about my why, we were speaking a lot about why I have started the Facebook group that I have started, why I have done some writing workshops, and how I think that sharing our stories with one another, like I said, is not only healing for the person that's writing it, but also can be extremely helpful to the person that is reading it. And so for your audience, I have some ideas, some tips for sharing the stories amongst generations, which I think is something that could be really cool, particularly now when we're all stuck in the house.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I really want to get into it. I, I actually, one of my notes really says, I wanted to ask you, uh, one of the things that I really like about you and admire is that you are very comfortable sharing your life experiences. Like you have written that, that's really how you have felt able to connect with others. That's how you have been able to make meaning. And this idea has come up before. I feel the same way too, that like when we become the teacher, we also learn.
Right.
And I like, it's so cool to talk about words and writing and stuff like that, particularly words. This podcast was almost called Use Your Words, because that is something
Oh, wow.
that parents say and preschool teachers say to little children all the time.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't quite, I preferred We Turned Out Okay, because people, we have these memories, like people used to say all the time, right? Well, we turned out okay. Like this happened to us, or, my parents beat me up and I turned out okay. And I like, that's really flip. And I didn't want it to have that energy, but instead I wanted it to have the energy of like, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Because no matter what happens, there are ways that we can figure out to make it. So,
Indeed so. Indeed so.
Yeah. And I wondered if you might share about an experience, or a couple even, that got you to where you are today. And you mentioned your divorce. I'm curious, what happened there? Like, why does that come up for you as the thing that really, is the
Sure.
beginning of the experiences with a capital?
Yep. Yep. Well, I had a lot of support from family and from friends. And my connection with God was also very, very important to me, particularly during that time, because it was a very difficult time. But what I also started doing during that time was blogging.
Oh, awesome.
And I began to realize that that was the quickest way I could get out some of my feelings, some of my fears, some of my frustrations. It's just by writing it out, or actually typing it out into a blog. And then what was really interesting for me is I had an opportunity to be in an anthology where women were just sharing their stories, their challenges, and how they had kind of gotten to their other side of through as they were going through a difficult situation. And whereas I thought I was almost over it in terms of some of my own fears and frustrations, when I began to write my story, which was a part of that book, I found myself unearthing feelings that I thought I, had pretty much gotten over. I found myself remembering experiences that I thought were no longer going to be top of mind for me. So that was such a cathartic experience, just being forced to sit down and write my story from my perspective, most definitely, but with an idea of trying to make sure that somebody else got something out of it. So I didn't want to just harbor on this whole woe is me situation. Isn't this sad what happened to me? As much as I wanted to be certain that someone could read my story, but from it be encouraged and realize that if she got through that, so can I.
Wow.
And that's what I think is so very important. And that's why I think it's so important that we share our stories. And you're right, there are some parts of my story that are personal that I'll never share, but there are other parts that are personal, but I think it's worth sharing because I think it will help somebody really understand what I went through during that time and how they can get through it, and more importantly, get over it. Like I like to say, people don't need to know the dirty details because they don't really care.
Mm-hmm.
What they really want to know is how your story pertains to them, how your story can be used to educate, encourage, or inspire someone else. And so that's what I try to do in my writing. I've written my own book where I tell a lot of different little stories, but the goal is always to try to make sure that somebody else learns from my own experience.
Mm-hmm.
And from it and sees themselves in it. It's not all heavy, because nobody wants to be all heavy, I don't think, especially now, right?
Yeah,
But,
especially
if we get an opportunity to see ourselves in somebody else's situation, then and giggle and laugh and exhale in
Yep.
the midst of going through something difficult, then I think that's what's important.
That, I tell you, that really resonates with me so deeply. I spent a couple of years as a live storyteller. So I did
Oh,
moth-like
wow.
storytelling. So I little brag. I won the first competition I ever entered, which felt really good.
Oh, wow,
And
Karen.
one of the reasons was because I had a great story to tell, that I think about as tragedy plus time equals comedy. It was that sort of thing. That not everything can be thought of that way, but this was a story about, I'd lived in Italy for 6 months as a college student, so I was a young 20 something, and managed to never really get in Italy at that time. So we're talking the early 90s. You couldn't be, I think, a woman at all, but perhaps an American woman. They would hear your accent, and suddenly guys were hanging on you, like, do you have a boyfriend? Are you married? Da da da. But a lot of people were coming back to, classes, because I took classes there, and they were sharing they'd been, groped or something like that. And I was like,
Oh,
so I
wow.
left Italy, and I was like, phew, I made it all the way through without getting groped. I got my butt grabbed in the worst, most egregious way. Um,
Oh,
in Austria, of all places. And,
oh no.
and so my story is about how I lost my temper. I happened to be carrying a bag of oranges at the time.
Uh-oh.
I let this person have it with my bag of oranges and a lot of chips. I was like, what do you think I'm going to do here? Like, what? And so at the time, I was with a friend, so I wasn't like frightened for my life or anything.
Right.
I was so upset and angry. It took me years to see the funny in it. There is some funny in it,
Right.
And so, so what you're saying really, really resonates and makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask, and I suspect that this is going to lead into your ideas about, what parents can do right now with their kids. Is
Mhm.
um, when we are thinking about, especially in the pandemic, I was at my therapist today, and he was sharing with me that, because this January, February have been particularly difficult months personally for me in all of this. Um, Not because anything more horrible is happening, but just
Yeah.
because of something. I don't, it's hard to even define what. And I'm hearing from so many listeners and clients and friends that it's the same for them. And my therapist was telling me that there is now research showing that, like, this is weighing on us and we don't even know it. Like,
Mhm.
so many people have, so many lives have been claimed in this, and
Yeah.
we're just living with it every day, and we're denied what, the self-soothing that we used to, be able to,
Yeah.
seeing friends and going out and all those kinds of things. And that's been really, really hard. I think it's hard for us adults, and I think in some ways maybe it's even harder on children because they have less of a capacity to use their words.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts, on how a parent might help draw words, might help connect with their child, in all of this, to help their child feel better.
Sure. I've thought of three things that I've known of other families doing that I think has worked in terms of sharing our stories, particularly during this time of what I call transition, when we're realizing that we can't go outside like we used to, and we can't do much of anything. Life is so very different. And I think that this provides a really cool opportunity to share our stories. And one of the things that I know some families are doing is taking advantage of the fact that many families have three, maybe even four generations that are still around and are still vital. And I think that some of these folks are getting on Zoom conversations and sharing stories, just sharing stories. I know of one particular family that, like, dedicates a week. They do this thing weekly, and each week is dedicated to a particular generation. So the grandparents may come on and tell their stories, and then the parents, and then the children. Um, sometimes it can be difficult to know, like, tell my story. What does that mean? Is it, I was born here and this, that, and the other. But what I think is interesting is that you can give people themes to talk about.
Yeah.
So you could say, this week, we're going to hear from the grandparents and they're going to talk about the games that they played. And this week, we're going to hear from the grandkids and they're going to talk about what they think about virtual learning. Whatever that theme is, it's a great way to open up the conversation. And it's a great way to give people an opportunity to share their stories. Maya Angelou has this quote that I really like, and she says that there's no greater agony than bearing within you an untold story. And the reality is we all like to talk about ourselves, right? But sometimes we just don't get the opportunity to do so. So I think that, having those Zoom discussions, sometimes you can even do that discussion in your home with your immediate family. You can have story hour, and instead of you reading from a book, people get an opportunity to tell their own story. What happened of interest to you this week? What frightened you this week? It's a great way to just get your feelings out and to share in the form of a story. One thing that I think could be cool, because I love the written word, is to encourage our children, our grandchildren, nieces and nephews to write their story out. And parents can do this too. Write it out and then maybe bring everybody together to read it and then consolidate it. Create a book. KDP Press allows you to do that for not very expensive. Yeah. That's the press that's affiliated with Amazon.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
If you do the work of laying it all out, they'll very inexpensively create for you a book. And how cool would it be to come out of this pandemic with your family's book? This is how we made it.
I love it. I mean, so much is resonating. First of all, the idea of, I think after a year, we are all extremely done with like endless Zoom calls that don't have a point, but everybody's
right.
Talk and everybody can't. And just as you were talking, I was remembering, this is the third year we've done this. So there's always my mother's extended family Zoom call. And this year, my uncle, the guy who usually puts it all together, he conceived of breakout rooms where like there's 30 of us or something. So a bunch of breakout rooms where we would go into a breakout room and talk, with this group of people for 10 or 15 minutes and then switch out, come back out and switch into another one. And the way that he did it, he said, what I was thinking about was when we were all at grandma's, which is his mom, but anyway, when we were all at grandma's, some people gathered in the kitchen, some people gathered in the family room, some people gathered in the living room, some people were on the back porch. And that's how he named them. Like, so you could
that is cool.
Put into the dining room, right? Or into the
I love it.
It was like so cool. And so I think I would love it if you'd kind of talk a little bit about why parameters like that. Like, why is it better to have a call with a theme than one that, is just a call?
It's a free for all. Well, I think it gives people a little bit of structure and it takes the fear away, because not everyone is going to be comfortable telling their story. Sometimes I think people think that if you're asking them to tell their story, they're expected to say something that's dramatic or something that's going to make people, be shocked. Or the reality is it doesn't have to be anything particularly tragic, particularly wonderful, dramatic at all. We just want to hear what you're talking about, what you're feeling. We want to hear, a little bit about your history, because that's extremely important, I think, for the younger generation to know what their parents went through, what their grandparents went through, some of the things they enjoyed, some of the things they feared. I think that's what's needed for this next generation to keep moving forward. And so I think the theme just kind of takes some of that fear away. If I know all I got to talk about is the toys I played with as a child, or, if all I got to talk about is one of my favorite memories or my favorite summer vacation, then it just kind of makes it an easier exercise for everybody to come to the table with something to say.
And what's so cool about that too is especially a child isn't, as you're in it, you're having fun, because
Yes.
everybody else brought their stories. So you get to share in this. And then the other thing I wanted to come back to was the idea of creating a book. So you, like me, know and love and understand the value of books, things that you can look at again and again. And what a book is, what words on paper are, is communication that's just in a different form, right? So it's and I think this might actually, if I think about what is at the root of me wanting to talk to you, Gail Clanton, it was this idea. My sense is that we both have a real love and respect of like the written word, because at its heart, it's somebody's thoughts that they've put down on paper, and now anytime I want to, I can go and see them.
Yes.
And this is so
Yeah.
significant for children, especially. And if we can take their words and just to build on what you were saying, if you have if you do a Zoom and you record it, there's a company called temi.com, TEMI, and like for 10 cents a word, you can get something that is clear. They're not going to be able to take all of the different people and understand them all, but like if one person is reading their story or telling their story, you can go to temi.com and you can, for 10 cents a word, you can have them transcribe it so that it's at least
Oh,
in some
cool.
form that's easy for you to, you can put it into Microsoft Word or Open Office,
That's cool.
right? And then you can take those words and you can put them in a book. And then anytime anybody wants to, they can go back and look at the book. Isn't
Yeah, that is cool. I love that.
that neat? I'm going to write
I
down
love that.
resources. Um,
My.com. I have to remember that.
yeah.
Thanks.
And then KDP as well. I'm gonna remember to link to, because anybody can do this. I think. Do you? Well, what another question I have for you is: do you see fears stopping people from writing, from putting their words on paper or into a blog or something like that? You're
I
not?
think so. Yeah, I definitely do. I've done a couple of writing workshops at the very beginning of COVID. I thought that would be a pretty neat way to get some people who may be a little bit afraid of writing to write, because we had something to talk about, right? We were talking about being inside and this whole life transition. And so what I did for these ladies, was mostly ladies, was I created an outline that said, this is how you start, and then you say this, and then you say that. And it just kind of helped them to organize their thoughts. And they all did really, really well. The next workshop that I did, a lot of these same ladies were in the second workshop, and they didn't need the outline nearly as much,
Mm-hmm.
because they began to figure out for themselves how they wanted to organize their thoughts. So sometimes I think it just merely takes sitting back for a minute and just thinking like, okay, what's the object of this thing that I'm writing? What do I really want to get across? I also think people get nervous because they think that their grammar's going to be off, but a good editor can fix that.
Yep.
If you may not be the best writer, then you send it to your friend or your colleague who is. But the authenticity of what you're saying is something that only you can say. So you just be in charge of that part, is what I tell people. And then you send it to somebody else to just kind of clean up your words and make sure you're using the right form of to and there, and all that kind of stuff.
Those things that
The
can
editorial
scale
stuff
people.
is so not important when the world is waiting for your story. The world wants to know what it is that you have to share. And I really encourage people not to be hung up on grammar,
Oh, thank
not to
you.
be hung up on word use. Just tell your story.
Like the way.
And the other thing, one last thing, Karen,
Sure,
the
sure.
other thing I like to tell people is just speak it. Sometimes you can just speak it, record yourself, or go to like one of these websites like you just mentioned. Because sometimes you may be able to speak it better than you can write it.
Yeah.
And you get fearful every time you sit before a keyboard or grab a pen. But if you just speak it, it may flow so much easier for you.
So I for almost a decade, when this comes out, in June of 2011, I developed a tendon disorder. I didn't know it at the time, but it was I had needed some rounds of an antibiotic that had fluoroquinolones in it. And in these intervening years, we've learned that fluoroquinolone can cause tendon problems, tendon rupture, stuff like that. And in my case, it's lasted. Like I'm one of those, my rheumatologist once said, like, you're a 1 in a million kid, like, because a very small amount of people, this doesn't go away. And that appears to be me. And so what it's meant is, I mean, I feel like this whole conversation is developing in such a cool way. So parameters, boundaries, guidelines as a way to address fear and keep going is I really feel that in this conversation. It's such a strong through line. And in my own case, if I hadn't gotten the tendon disorder, there wouldn't be a podcast. There wouldn't be the books. There wouldn't be these things, because my life was narrowed down to such a small, I lost the ability to walk for several months. And then I took a couple of years to regain it. And I lost my thumbs and I'm still dealing with that, really. Things pop up frequently with this, but on the flip side, once I had figured out what it was and how to move through it, and a friend said to me, okay, so, the sort of householdy things are off the table for you. You're not folding laundry. You're not cooking dinner. Okay. What opportunity does this open up for you? And so these became the parameters in which I needed to function. And everything I do is by voice. All the writing I've done is by voice. Website building, emailing, everything is done by voice. And what that means is, I once had somebody review my book, and one of my books, and what she said is, there's so much you in these pages. And I think it's really because your personality comes out through your speech. And so these books, if I'd used a keyboard, they wouldn't have been the same. They just wouldn't have had the same tone and feeling. And I think if someone's listening and they want to try it, but they're embarrassed, and you may also have something to say, Gail, about this. My thought is, try it anyway. Like, there's this idea of feel the fear and do it anyway, because that's the only way that you're going to see, maybe it wasn't so bad. Oh, here's a different way to do it. Here's, something to try. So does that make sense? Are you feeling that too?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And Karen, I commend you for stepping outside of what you knew, the familiar, to figure out how it is that you could still do those things that you were called and meant to do. So I applaud you for that. And I think that some of the people that are listening to us will take note of the fact that there are many ways to do what it is we need to accomplish. And so if you need to write it out, you write it out. Some people don't feel like they can speak it. And if you need to speak it, you speak it. But I think the point that I would want to make, just to echo what you're saying, is that we all do have a voice that needs to be heard, whether it is read, whether it is spoken, whether it's shared in a book, whether it's shared through a website, whether it's shared with a peer or a child. I just think that we all ought to embrace the value that is placed within us, recognize that we all have something to say, and find the best way to say it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. That really sums it up so beautifully. And I appreciate what you said too about just about me and about this journey. I feel like I think of it as in my old life, I was a caterpillar, and the especially the first, I would say 3, 4, 5 years of the tendon disorder were the chrysalis, and I'm a butterfly. Right. I get to be the butterfly, and I wouldn't see this if I hadn't gone through that. And we've been talking a lot in our home about the hero's journey, the heroine's journey. The idea of everybody sort of, we're all on our own hero's journey, and what does that look like, and what are the challenges that come up, and how do you get past them, and how do you bring that to the world once you have learned that lesson, and
you learned it, right?
Yeah.
I talk a lot about the whole analogy of the butterfly too, so it's just like really cool that you bring that up. But one thing that I think is really interesting about the story and the evolution of the butterfly is that once it works its way out of that chrysalis, that it then eats it, which I originally thought was like the most disgusting thing ever, right? That thing that kept the butterfly bound, it then eats, it doesn't discard it. And when I think about that in terms of our lives, and I think about those things that kept us bound, those things that kept us from being all that we really wanted to be, why would I want to keep it with me? Why would I want to eat it? And I think it is because then we can share it, and then we can tell somebody else about how we went through it. So like what you're saying, you ate it to the point where you can tell somebody else, hey, I remember when, you know, I was a little nervous about, was I going to be able to keep doing the things that I wanted to do? For me, I remember when I was in a difficult situation, going through an expensive, long, and horrible divorce. So I had to eat that experience so that it's still with me to the point where I can share it with somebody else. And I don't forget it myself, so that the next time I go through my own challenge, I can remember how I got through the last challenge. So I love the idea of the butterfly. And for me, that's the part that really resonates. At first it was like, you know, I guess I didn't really understand the whole transformation process. I thought one day it's a caterpillar, the next day it's a butterfly, but I didn't know what happens in between that period of struggle. And then the fact that that thing that kept the caterpillar bound, the butterfly then eats it so that it stays with it. So so anyway, I just had to share that.
Yeah, no, I'm really grateful. I'm so fascinated with it. And I can see so much symbolism in that. Like, you're metabolizing this.
Yes.
Like it immediately made me, so I'm facing, even today, I've got some, like on this day that we are talking, I'm having trouble walking right now. I've got a new issue. And I sat down to go to my therapist. I sat down in the car and I put on "It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll," that AC/DC song. And
Yes.
that's the way of, it's linked with what you're saying about eating the chrysalis, because it's like, I am looking at this and I am telling it, like I'm eating it, right? Like I'm making this, I am being the master and not the servant here, I think is another way that I think of it. Like, I've got this situation is what I'm really living in. How can I, what lessons can I learn from it? Like, what is it trying to tell me? And all that is, I love the symbolism of digesting it, of metabolizing it. I'm fascinated with that. I'd never heard that.
Yeah. It was during my divorce process when people started giving me butterflies, and I started thinking about, not butterflies literally, but you know,
like images,
cards with butterflies on them and jewelry with butterflies. And I was taking on that whole idea of transformation, you know? And so that's when I began to kind of look a little deeper into the butterfly's transformation process. And so it's so interesting. It is so interesting. At least for me it was, because it was not at all as beautiful as I thought. There were some painful times in it too.
Yeah. I wonder what it's like to be a caterpillar in a chrysalis. Like, what is that process like? And I think maybe there is some pain, but also maybe there is some sustenance that comes out of that for us. And I think if we're looking at COVID and we're looking at this insanity that we're all living with, I mean, I maybe we're all going to be butterflies. Like, maybe we're all in our chrysalis, and I think coming out of it ready to digest that, ready to eat it, and know that it's going to give us strength, and it's going to make it better, easier for us to go and tell our story and help others. I think I've actually got goosebumps. I mean, I love thinking about this in this way. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gail.
But we're going to come out of it stronger because, as you probably know, the butterfly has to stretch itself. You know, that it's already growing in that chrysalis. And then it begins to get to the point where the wings are formed and the chrysalis is too tight. It's very tight around the wings. So it has to force its way out. And the thought is that if it doesn't force its way out in terms of building strength in those wings so that it opens up the chrysalis, if it doesn't build the strength in those wings, then it dies because it'll come out and not be able to fly. So it's got to go through that struggle. So in terms of COVID, I think we've got to come out of it stronger because we will have learned some lessons. We will have, we will have learned some new things. I mean, I never was the Zoom expert that I am today.
I'm sure. Yes.
I never would have written my book. I never would have done it. There's a lot that I would not have done had I not been during, going through this period of COVID.
Yeah.
So my hope is that when when we can go out again, when we can fly, that I and many of us will just be stronger for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. What doesn't kill us makes us grow stronger.
Right.
That's something that my son, one of my kids, has been saying a lot lately, and it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Our time is short, and I want to ask you, do you have a couple of minutes after the hour, or must you stop at 2?
I can go a little bit longer.
Okay,
sure.
Cool. Because I really want to. This has been an awesome rabbit hole. Like, one of my favorite things about conversations is I don't know where they're going to go. It's so cool. But I don't want to leave without hearing the other ideas that you have for parents about with words and writing and getting through this time with their kiddos. So
Sure. So I had 3 thoughts. One was the idea of bringing people together on Zoom conversations, allowing each generation to tell a story. And if necessary, or not even necessary, but you may want to give people a theme to just make the exercise a little easier. The other thought was to write your own book, your story of your own family. And then the other thing is really kind of easy, but I've done it myself and found it fascinating. And that's going to your own genealogy. I purchased a ancestry.com membership and have just found that fascinating. Looking into my own family history and being blessed enough that I have some older members of my family that I can ask questions of based upon what I found in Ancestry. So there'll be names that I'll see that don't mean anything to me, but they'll mean something to my mother, who may remember her grandmother mentioning this particular person. So I think it's a cool time right now, again, figuring out your story, to just go back in time and figure out who some of your relatives are. But I think, the bottom line is I would just encourage parents to take this time to connect not only with their children, but with other parents too. Because one of the things that I talked about on the podcast with Amber and her girls is that I think that children have, I guess, sometimes more built-in opportunities to connect and to find their own communities, like they've got Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and soccer teams and, and even classroom pals. But sometimes adults find it a little bit more difficult. So I think as adults connect with one another in Facebook groups or LinkedIn groups or, neighborhood pals or whatever, they'll get ideas from their peers and be able to find ways to connect with their children, particularly now that they're home all the time.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I think that's 3 really interesting and very different ideas about how things you could be doing that would be fostering connections, that would be building community in this time where that's one of the things that I think people are finding most challenging is like keeping up a community or creating one if there hadn't been a very big one prior. And I just love that that you bring those ideas up, especially with younger children. One of the things that's really fun is they love to hear those stories too. I mean, they love to think about who came before them in terms of their ancestors and what did they come through. And I'm trying to remember one of my nephews. This nephew is in college now, so this was a long, long time ago. But when he was maybe a first or a second grader, the assignment that he had was to interview his grandpa and to ask him about, what the kinds of things that you mentioned. What toys did you like to play with when you were my age? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it's just so neat. I think it's so helpful to them to see like this old person was once my
Right.
age, right? You know, this person
Yeah.
that it's very hard for a young child to experience. There's this wonderful quote. It is, youth cannot know how age thinks and feels. And I actually believe that J.K. Rowling wrote that into, it
Hmm.
comes out of Albus Dumbledore's mouth in her book. So, but I don't know if she got it from anywhere else. Not 100% sure. But anyway, youth cannot know how age
Uh-huh.
feels. But this is one way that you can help a child get in touch with, you know, and understand, like, this person wasn't always this age or whatever. Like,
Right.
what was life like?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
fascinating and very, very cool. I cannot believe how quickly this has gone, our time. And I am wondering if there's anything that you thought of or that you'd like to kind of bring up as we're finishing up that we haven't gone into yet. Is there any other thoughts that you have?
I don't think so. I just like to encourage people to try to make the best use of this time, because I do think that once the outside opens back up for us, we're gonna. I hope we don't get too back into our hurried lifestyle. You know, there's something to be said about this time of slowing down.
Mhm.
And I was one that was always doing something, you know, was always running here, always running there. And I'm really hoping that we all will kind of take note of what's happening right now and figure out how the best of this can translate over into when life opens up again. I also think we ought to take advantage of this time, just like I said, just to connect with
Yeah.
one another, make new friends, you know,
Yeah.
um, do those things that we always thought we wanted to do, but just didn't quite have the time to do. And of course, tell your story in any way that you can.
Thank you. Yes, I think those are so important. I am remembering too that you've got a couple of really cool projects that I wanted to ask you about before we finished up. So I'm really grateful that you can go a little bit longer. One is an anthology, and
Yes.
the other is you called it a solo project. So I'd love to hear about that one too.
Okay, sure. Well, the anthology is really cool because I think I mentioned a little earlier that pretty early in the time of the pandemic and being locked inside, I started doing these writing workshops with ladies. And I did one, and then I did a second one, and several of the ladies were so they had fun. You know, they enjoyed the connection with one another. So they were also in the second anthology. And then I got to thinking, okay, now what do I do next? And so I thought, well, let me give them an opportunity to see their words in print. And so I decided on this idea of an anthology, which is called Living in the Key of Joy, because I said the only prerequisite is it can't be a sad story. It can't have a sad ending,
Hmm.
because right now we don't need a sad ending. We need stories that are going to make us smile and bring us joy. And so I'm so very thankful that 22 ladies raised their hands and said, yes, I do want to be a part of this project. And so they're actually in the process of writing their stories now. And the book should launch early June. So we're really, really excited about that. Living in the Key of Joy. It'll be on Amazon, and it's gonna be cool. Some of the stories so far have been about ladies who got through serious illnesses, and at the other end felt joy. People who went through relationship issues, and at the other end found joy. People who had travel experiences that were wonderful and found joy. People who tried something new and found joy. So it's a wonderful variety of stories. Some are lighter than others, which is great, but they all have a happy ending. And so I'm really excited about that. And then my solo project is my own book called Sparkle in the Rain. And that's really almost, it's like a memoir for me. Um, it starts out telling the story of my period of what I call my period of transition, when I was going from being a married woman to an unmarried woman. So I talk about some of the challenges with that, but then I've included a lot of my blog posts. So things that I wrote to encourage myself while I was going through that period, and also observations, things that I noticed. I'd like to laugh at myself sometimes because I can sometimes find meaning in the most mundane situation. And so I include some of that. So that book, I say, is part memoir, part storytelling, and part devotional, because at the end of many of those chapters, I pose questions to the reader, and then I give them a chance to write in their own responses and observations too.
Really cool.
So that book will actually be available in March, starting in March, and it'll be on Amazon too and on my website.
Cool. So when you're listening to this will be out in, I'm going to say, either late April or early May. That means you will have a book to go to gailclanton.com and purchase now, and then you'll have another one to pre-order or go back and get when it comes out in June. And I love that so when you first started talking about living in the key of joy, and you said, I want them to be happy stories, or I want them to have happy endings. My first thought was that they be happy stories, but I love that they include challenges. They include, like, it's not really a story, right? Unless something happens. And so I think it was J.R.R. Tolkien said something like, it simply isn't an adventure without any dragons, something like that. And I'm like, I love that. So these are stories where things really happen to these people, but they end up, they learn things, they come out of it, they conclude by feeling joyful.
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you, but I think I caught it. So yeah, these are actual true stories. So these are experiences that these people have gone through, lived through, and then came out with a happy ending. So I didn't want, people to be left feeling like, oh, poor person, as much as, right. As much as, hey, look, they got through this serious situation and now they're living in the key of joy. And hey, they tried this new thing and now they're living in the key of joy. So that's the idea behind the project.